El passat 6 de novembre, l'economista en cap del Banc Mundial, Goldberg, va inaugurar el curs 2019-2020 de la Facultat d'Economia i Empresa de la UPF. L'impressionant currículum de Goldberg inclou haver sigut professora a les universitats de Columbia, Princeton i Yale, i també va ser l'editora en cap de l'American Economic Review, una de les revistes acadèmiques més importants en el camp de l'economia. El degà de la facultat, Walter García Fontes, va exercir d'amfitrió i va donar la benvinguda als nous alumnes.
El nostre enfocament de la docència està molt relacionat amb la nostra concepció de la recerca.
La taula també va ser presidida pel catedràtic José García Montalvo en representació del rectorat, qui va donar el curs acadèmic per inaugurat. També per l'investigador Jaume Ventura, que va presentar a la conferenciant, i per Pilar Miracle en representació dels laboratoris Doctor Esteve, patrocinadors de l'esdeveniment. La lliçó portava per títol Els efectes desiguals de la globalització i va analitzar les conseqüències d'aquesta tendència econòmica durant les últimes dècades per intentar explicar el replegament proteccionista que s'ha viscut els últims anys. Goldberg va començar definint l'era de la globalització, tendència que va arribar al seu punt àlgid durant la dècada dels 90 i que va començar a canviar a partir de la crisi financera del 2008.
So let me start with the age of globalization. So why do we speak of globalization? So here are a few facts that explain why we talk about globalization in the first place. The measurable trade barriers, so mainly tariffs, have come down in the last few decades. And most importantly, for my purposes here, most developing countries are now fully integrated in the world trading system. And importantly, China, India, many countries in the Southeast Asia, but also many countries in Latin America are now integrated. This upward trend intensifies during the 90s, and people often refer to the 90s as being the decade of hyper-globalization. So this is the time when global value chains come into the picture, when production gets fragmented and parts and components crisscross borders multiple times. Then around 2007, 2008, you can see a dip. That's the global financial crisis. Trade collapses during the financial crisis. After that, it recovers, but it never gains its old momentum. So many people everywhere, but also in the World Bank, are particularly worried about the fact that trade seems to be growing very slowly compared to the trend it had before the global financial crisis, and that raises the question of how, of course, developing countries are going to be affected.
A continuació, Goldberg va exposar els 3 motius de l'augment del comerç i va apuntar que podríem estar entrant a una nova era.
What are the drivers of this trade growth? Okay, so what contributed to this explosion of trade? Here I'm going to make 3 points. So there are going to be 3 main takeaways, I hope, from this talk. The first one is that the world trade expansion has been due to policy as much as the decline of transport and communication costs. The second one is that the claims of a secular slowdown after the global financial crisis are premature. And the third one is that the recent backlash against globalization may lead to an era of sustained deglobalization. So in my view, there are good reasons to be concerned that we may be entering a new era.
Per explicar el replegament actual de la tendència globalitzadora, Goldberg va reivindicar la importància que tenen les polítiques econòmiques dels estats.
Until recently, there was a widespread belief, both among academics but also among policymakers and public commentators, that policy was irrelevant for the growth of trade. And this belief was rooted on the view that globalization was driven by technology, was driven by the decline in transport and communication costs. And one consequence of this belief was that people viewed globalization as a process that was inevitable and unstoppable. Needless to say, what has happened in the last few years indicates that it's not an unstoppable process, that policy is important.
Així, qüestionava la creença que la globalització depèn únicament de les millores tecnològiques.
Now let me talk about what we have been experiencing in recent years, namely the retreat from globalization.
Per entendre el moment desglobalitzador que estem vivint, Goldberg va apuntar a la reacció mundial contra el trànsit de persones i de mercaderies. El canvi seria tan important que el futur de l'Organització Mundial del Comerç sembla incert.
We see a very strong policy backlash against globalization, and this backlash takes many forms. So we see a backlash against both trade and immigration. Of course, these are two different phenomena, but in both cases, they have something in common. Both cases have something in common, namely that goods or people cross borders. So in some sense, I view that as a closing of the borders. The World Trade Organization is facing an existential crisis, and it's not clear it's going to still exist next year.
A continuació, Goldberg es va preguntar si la desglobalització actual era un simple moment de reajustament o si realment estem vivint en un canvi de tendència cap al proteccionisme.
So, against this background, the natural question to ask is this just a small blip in the wave of globalization? So is it the case that globalization is indeed unstoppable and this is just a small break that countries are taking? Or are we at the beginning of a new era of sustained deglobalization? And here I want to make the point that, of course, no one knows the answer, but the answer is going to depend on the policy choices we make in the future. And in order to inform these policy choices, it's important to understand why we see this backlash in the first place. So why do we see this retreat from globalization and why now?
Per entendre els motius que han fomentat les resistències a la globalització, la conferenciant va explicar que, si bé a un nivell global ara hi ha més igualtat entre països, la desigualtat dins dels estats sí que hauria augmentat.
So to make a long story short, in Africa, poverty is still increasing. In the rest of the world, it's declining. And it has declined particularly fast in East Asia and Pacific. So in those areas that have been most integrated in the world trading system. But there is another reason that makes it so that the general environment in many advanced countries is very receptive to these calls for protectionism. And this has to do with within-country inequality, with the rise of within-country inequality.
Com a conclusió, Goldberg va proposar que la globalització ha afectat de manera irregular a diferents nivells econòmics i socials i va rebutjar que es pogués generalitzar sobre els seus efectes.
I think it's fair to say that the effects of globalization have been uneven. They have been uneven across countries. They have been uneven within countries. They have been uneven across formal and informal workers. They have been uneven across producers and consumers. But I think saying something such as the globalization has increased inequality would not be justified because the answer really depends on what dimension of inequality you look at.
Això sí, va especificar que la globalització comporta alteracions i per això va recomanar que en el futur la recerca s'enfoqui a les transicions i els ajustos.
That said, what is very clear to me is that globalization causes disruption and there is need for adjustment. And with that in mind, I would suggest as a direction for further research, for future research, I would suggest that people focus much more on transitions and adjustment rather than steady states. Most of our work in economics, but especially in trade, tends to focus on steady states, partly because these are easier to handle analytically, but then all the action is really often in the adjustment. So I will stop here and thank you very much.
La lliçó va concloure amb un torn de preguntes en què es va aprofundir en els efectes actuals i futurs de la globalització.
Very nice.